Bated breath. Bated breath. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the In the Tank podcast, episode 310. Today, we're going to be talking about electric cars and the myriad of terrible public policy that surrounds them on this episode of In the Tank. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal, and joining me today, I've got Chris Talgo, senior editor at the Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
Doing good, Donnie. Thanks for having me on again.
Of course. Isaac Orr, it's been a while. You are a research policy fellow, at the Center of the American Experiment. How are you, good sir?
That's correct. Thanks for getting it right. I'm good.
Fantastic. I love your poster behind you.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and not the Brett Favre one, the cow one. Also right. Joining us, a special guest, we have Robert Bryce, research fellow at the Foundation for Research and Equal Opportunity. How are you, good sir? Doing good? Oh, technical difficulties?
Joke's on the viewers. Robert Bryce is not on the show. Just kidding.
Hang on. Here, can you? Oh, he's going to have to refresh or something. Well, that's unfortunate. It was just working before we live. All right, let's pivot. Isaac. So, I was talking to you earlier this week, and I was saying I asked you to come on the show, which you agreed to.
Graciously.
And I was asking about potential topics that we should discuss. And you called to my attention the fact that GM has issued a recall on 73,000 Chevy Bolts because I think the floor mats tended to bunch up, by the pedals. Oh, and the battery overheats and tends to explode and set the car on fire. So
I hadn't heard about the first issue, but the second issue is a big problem.
Yeah.
So
a little bit of a big problem. And that kind of started this whole conversation about electric vehicles and how lame they are and the public policy that's intending to push electric vehicles on the public, regardless of how unpopular and effective they are. And so we're like, you know what? Why don't we dedicate the entire episode to electric vehicles?
Sure.
So,
so the main takeaway for today, and we're going to have Robert back on soon, hopefully, because he's talked a lot about this and done some really good work, but electric cars don't need to be lame. They just are because of bad government policy. So
that's a nice hot take.
I know my takes are very hot these days. But basically what's happening is we have a system where we are pushing these cars into the market prematurely. Where we have an administration now in the White House that's trying to strong arm automakers into producing more of these than the market is ready to handle. And as a result, we are getting safety issues. We're getting higher prices. So this all boils down to bad policy propping them up. But we can get into this all a little bit more detail.
Yeah, no doubt. Oh, looks like Robert's trying to join us. Can he speak
now? What
now?
about now?
We got him.
How do I smell? It's okay.
Oh man.
All right, fantastic. Awesome. I was spinning wheels a little bit, waiting for you to refresh. So
burning rubber.
A little bit, yeah. So for our longtime listeners, you might know of Robert. He joined us back in episode 183 back in March of 2019. Back then, you were working on a documentary titled Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. And I actually watched that in preparation for this podcast. I watched it. It is available on Amazon Prime for free. You just have to suffer through some commercials, but that's
and Roku channel for free.
Oh, beautiful. There you go. Or you could probably buy the DVD off of a website or something like that. I'm sure you can
stream it on all the major streaming platforms. It is available.
So I watched it, and the most amazing thing about it to me, when you watch this, you go to Africa, you go to India, you go to Puerto Rico, And it's amazing how much electricity and reliable energy is taken for granted by so many people here in America. Like that was, to me, was the biggest takeaway of all of this.
Sure.
I mean, that's like, I don't think your average person realizes how much of a luxury it is to have cheap, reliable energy any day, anytime, any part of the year.
I completely agree. And, I think of all the places we went, I get asked, well, what did you learn? Or what was the most surprising thing? Or I think it's that people will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. And it's true all over the world. We saw it in India, where theft of electricity was very common. We saw it in Lebanon, and now Beirut, of course, is in total collapse. The entire country of Lebanon is in collapse, but people were paying the generator mafia in Beirut to make sure that they got a reliable electricity. We saw it in Puerto Rico, where people are using, small portable generators. And we see it today in Louisiana. Just on Tuesday, I think it was Tuesday alone, there were 12 people admitted to hospitals in St. Tammany Parish for carbon monoxide poisoning. Why? Because they're running electric generators because they're trying to get back on their feet. So electricity is the world's most important and fastest growing form of energy. And we take it for granted at our extreme peril.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I'm a huge fan. I really like that documentary. I've incorporated a number of things that you frequently discuss into my own lexicon. Energy being like the master resource, I think, is a very impactful concept. The vacant land myth, which you wrote about several years ago, is a point that I bring up all the time when discussing the shortcomings of wind and solar. And after today, I'm sure that I'll have more info on how electric vehicles are lame. So thank you in advance for that.
Well, I was thinking about this. How'd you like to be a Tesla dealer in New Orleans today?
Oh, God.
I mean, the people are queued up to buy gasoline, just a few gallons of gasoline. And yet this idea that this is a deeply dangerous idea that is being pushed by some of the biggest environmental groups in America, that we should electrify everything, including transportation. Well, go to Louisiana then and see how many people are driving electric vehicles. Effectively none. Why? Because the idea that we electrify everything means putting all of our energy eggs in one basket. And that's a dangerous position to take from the basic standpoint of societal resilience. And we need more resilience, not less. And if you don't believe that, look at what happened with Hurricane Ida. The idea that we're going to put all of that transportation demand on the electric grid. Well, the electric grid was destroyed in Louisiana. All the high voltage transmission lines into New Orleans were destroyed. So this idea, we'll rely solely on electricity. You're crazy. It is an absolutely terrible idea. And yet this idea is being pushed by some of the most powerful environmental groups in this country.
Yeah, one of the first articles that I came across when doing my research for this episode was an article that was written by you. It's time to unplug the hype over electric vehicles. And in the article, you start off by briefly talking about the long history of promises that electric vehicles were going to replace combustion engines. And eventually it was going to become commonplace in society for everyone to have electric vehicles. And this obviously didn't happen. And you write, quote, "The history of electric car is a century of failure, tailgating failure." So lay it on us. Why can't electric vehicles live up to the hype?
Well, sure. Well, let's start from today and work backward. I mean, what happened just in the last 10 days? General Motors recalled every one of the Chevy Bolts they've ever built at a cost that's going to be something on the order of $1.8 billion. Now, LG Chem may pay part of that, but how embarrassing is this for the largest American automaker to recall all of the EVs that they've made? And this is the same company that just about 8 months ago said, oh yeah, we're going to electrify our entire fleet in the next 5 or 10 years and only sell electric vehicles. Well, damn it, you can't even make one. You're going to sell millions and you can't even make one that doesn't catch on fire. I mean, this is one of the most embarrassing developments in corporate America that I've seen in years, that a company that has said we're staking our future on electric vehicles is recalling all of the ones that they've made so far. But then, in researching that, I had a piece on Forbes a few days ago about this. So now that's General Motors just in the last few days, right? But you look back at 1979 and they were rolling out a Chevy Chevette that they said was the new type of chemistry for a battery that they think is going to sweep the market. 1979. I mean, you can keep going back over the decades and see all these promises. Oh, a new battery, a new development. And today, where are we? Electric vehicles make up right about 2% of all vehicle sales in this country. 2%. Well, that doesn't sound to me like they're sweeping the marketplace. What they're doing is providing driveway jewelry for rich people because those are the only people buying them.
Yeah, that's actually a kind of an important point. I'm looking at some of these comments that are coming in. One says electric is great, but not a solution for everyone. The market will show that. Um, so right off the bat, I just want to clear this up that I am not suggesting that nobody is happy with the electric vehicle that they have. I'm sure that there are some cases of people that are very happy with a Tesla that they have or some type of Bolt if it's not lighting on fire that they have. But the more that I was doing the research into this for the show prep, the more it became clear to me that if this were to scale up to a point where it was commonplace and everyone had one, that the problems that we're going to talk about are going to get worse and worse, not better and better. So it's going to go in the opposite direction of what you would think if there was mass adoption to this. So in that first article that I mentioned, you said that the big problems with electric vehicles are affordability, resilience, and supply chains. So let's just kind of go through some of those, just one after the other. Let's start with affordability. You mentioned the idea of driveway jewelry for, wealthier people. It's I see here it says only purchased by wealthier end of the spectrum. Average household income for EV purchasers is $140,000, which is double the national average. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's just the average person is going out there and buying one of these. It's definitely an upper middle class, if not upper class type of thing.
Absolutely. And I was at Costco just in July, and there was a Chevy Bolt out in the front. And so I thought, okay, well, I'd seen one there last year. And so I thought, well, I'll go over, and I ended up taking some pictures and published them in the piece I ran in Forbes a few days ago. But it was a little Chevy Bolt that was about the size of a Toyota Corolla, $46,250. 46 large? Are you kidding me? I could buy a Beamer. I could buy a Benz for that much money. And you expect me to buy this crappy little thing that I have to recharge and spend potentially hours waiting to refuel? Are you out of your mind? And, now this is the same vehicle that is being recalled. So yes, I mean, Tesla buyers have an even higher, if memory serves, higher median household income than even the average EV buyer. So this idea that they're going to sweep the marketplace, well, they're still too expensive. And then the other part of the affordability that Donald and Isaac and I have talked about this many times is you try and build out the EV charging infrastructure. Well, the utilities are happy to do it. And sure, they're going to say, well, how many do you want? Sure, we'll rate base it all. So you have then a rate increase on all of the electricity users when the working class folks, the plumbers, the carpenters, the tradesmen, they're never going to drive a Tesla. And yet they're going to be forced to pay for the charging infrastructure that's needed for the Tesla drivers. It's just fundamentally unfair.
Yeah, I want to circle back to that one because I think that's actually a very important point. But just on top of the idea that these things are expensive, well, what does the government do when something's too expensive? Oh, they offer subsidies, right? So you talk about in this article, you say, consider California in 1990, state regulators mandated 10% of cars sold in the state be zero-emission vehicles by 2003. The state now offers up to $7,000 in rebates to EV buyers. In addition, EV drivers can use California's HOV lanes. What are HOV lanes?
High occupancy vehicles.
Oh, great. Even if they only have one person in the car. Despite these incentives, only about 6% of the cars in California today have an electric plug. So that's another thing that we've talked about in previous episodes of this podcast. This is the first policy, I guess, angle that I want to touch on, which is the rebates that are given to people that are buying these. And like we said, the average purchaser of one of these electric vehicles has a household income of $140,000. So we're talking about several $1,000s in rebates given to these people that are, by the average American standards, are wealthy. So it's like handouts to the wealthy. It's just that just seems like total opposite of what we think the government should do. When it's helping the poor people.
It's Robin Hood in reverse.
Right.
I mean, how does this make any sense? It doesn't. If wealthy people want to buy EVs, well, have at it. But don't make me subsidize your car. I don't expect you to subsidize my car. Why would I do that? And yet this is the way this market is evolving. Oh, we have to jumpstart it. Well, jumpstart it. Hell, we've had a century of jump starting. Why is it still so small? Oh, I don't know, because maybe people want other vehicles. This is just bad policy, and yet it's being driven by this climate change absolutism. That's well, we have to electrify everything. Well, there are other second and third order effects here that we have to consider before we push on this. And resilience, reliability, all of these things are part of it.
And then further in the article, it says 3 weeks ago, President Joe Biden signed an executive order that aims to make half of new cars sold in the U.S. by 2030 be electric. Making that happen, according to automakers, will require huge amounts of taxpayer money in form of subsidies. It'll also require about $50 billion to be spent on EV charging stations, according to a recent estimate by Alex Partners. The cost of those charging stations will likely be passed on to ratepayers in the form of higher electricity bills. So this is the point that I said I wanted to circle back to. And this kind of was a little bit, I guess, not necessarily a shocker to me because it made total sense, but it was just something that I didn't really think about. So can you kind of elaborate on this point about why more charging stations and more EV cars will actually make people's electricity bills go up?
Well, sure. These EV charging stations, they require high amperage, high voltage outlets. You need a 50 amp or more plug to fast charge your vehicle. Well, that's a lot of copper. Then you get, maybe your panel in your house or the substation in the neighborhood where they want to put in the charging station isn't robust enough. Well, then you need to replace the substation. Oh, and then you got all the copper from the substation to the charging station. And then you have the thing itself with the plug, with the meter, with all of that kit. All of it costs money. And who pays? Well, it's going to be the ratepayer unless the federal government says, oh, well, we'll pay for it all. Well, again, that's federal tax money that's being diverted into a very small elite group of people who are already rich. Why are we subsidizing effectively their motor fuel, their gasoline replacement? It's a regressive tax on the poor and the middle class.
So, Isaac, you've talked to me before about just kind of the electricity energy producers and that whole industry, and like it was kind of above my head. Like I don't, it just seems like
Classic.
a supply and demand thing. Like so many people make apples, and there's so many customers that want to buy apples.
Right.
That's not necessarily the case when it comes to energy production. So, is there anything that you would want to add on to Robert's comments about ratepayers having to pay more when it comes to more people plugging in?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about the market working, everything that you think you know about economics, you have to turn on your head for electricity because we have regulated monopolies, right? So these monopolies are not allowed to charge you enough to make a profit on the electricity they sell. Instead, they operate under something called a cost of service model. So state regulators, usually at a public service commission or a public utilities commission, basically set the price of electricity, and they set it in a way that the company is allowed to make a 10% profit off of anything that they build. So let's say they build an electric vehicle charging station for $30,000. They're allowed to recoup that $30,000 by increasing the price of electricity to pay for it, plus a 10% profit on top of it. And that's why you see all the electric companies lining up to support electric vehicles, because they know that this will increase the amount of money that they are guaranteed to make by regulators. So a study from Boston Consulting Group said for every electric vehicle on the grid, it'll essentially spur the need for $2,000 to $6,000 in grid upgrades. And that goes back to Robert's point of, like, you need a place to charge it. Not everybody has a plug-in that's large enough to accommodate a faster charging of an electric vehicle. So for those of you at home who have electric dryers, it's a 240 volt. Is that right, Robert? Yeah. Plug-in. And that still doesn't charge your car very quickly. So you have all of this extra demand that's coming onto the grid, and it's all at once. So you might actually need to build new power plants in order to accommodate the increase in charging that's going to come from electric vehicles. And I'm sure Donnie wants to talk about this later, but if you're in California, they say, oh, well, EV advocates say, oh, well, no, we'll just charge the cars at night when the demand for electricity is low. And this is actually going to reduce the amount of costs that other people have to pay. They pretend that electric vehicles will reduce costs for others on the grid. But that's just not the way it's ever going to work, because you have to have your car charging for several hours in order to get a full charge if you completely bring it down. So, and in California, they tell you not to charge your car when the power grid is low. So it's kind of like a snake eating its own tail.
Yeah, no, that whole thing just seems so backwards to me. It's like, if a company is being forced by mandate to do something that it knows it's not going to be profitable, it's going to lose money, right? Like if there was some government mandate to make sure that McDonald's sold X number of salads, every quarter or something like that, like they're going to lose money and they're going to be totally against it. But like when you're describing these electric companies, it's like they could be mandated to do stuff, but because it's this weird incestuous relationship, it doesn't even matter to them. They're like, yeah, sure, let's add some more things onto the grid. Like, it doesn't matter. We'll just raise the rates.
Exactly.
It's pretty crazy.
Well, I'll just, if I can just add to one quick thing to what Isaac said, he made a critical point, which was that California has been having blackouts regularly over the last few months, right? Some because of wildfires, some because they just don't have enough juice. Well, so this is the state that's pushed electric vehicles more than any other state in the country. And yet just a few weeks ago, they were telling consumers, oh, don't charge your electric vehicles. Well, wait a minute. Which is it? You want us to buy them, but you don't want us to charge them. Oh, you want us to buy them, but not charge them at certain hours. Well, that's not the way people do things. They need to do what they need to do when they need to do it. And this is one of the other issues around electricity demand and electricity supply, is that for working class folks and moms and women who work, they come home, they need to do their clothes right. They need to do their wash, do their laundry, all these other things right then. It's not something that they can shift to another time. So this idea that we're just going to shift all of this demand around to accommodate the grid, why can't we build the grid and make it robust enough that people can use electricity, say, whenever they want to?
And as much as they want.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was actually having a little debate with my brother this morning about all of this, because he's like super into Tesla and electric cars and all of that. And I was like, you better tune in, because we're going to grill these things during this whole episode. So that started this little comment war between us. And he was just saying, I brought up this idea of the grid resiliency and how this is just going to put more strain. If there's mass adoption, it's going to put more strain on the grid. And we already see the shortcomings of the grid in places like California, right, on a semi-regular basis, or when something terrible happens, like in Texas, when it got like abnormally cold during March or whatever that was. And his response to that was like, oh, just make a more robust grid. And it's like, well, that's a great idea, but it seems like the Democrats are rallying for the opposite of that in the name of, fighting climate change. It's like the more wind and solar that we put on the grid, the less reliable that grid is going to be. So It's like, I don't even know how we're simultaneously trying to pursue these two things at the same time. It just seems like we're setting ourselves up for disaster.
See, Donnie, that's why I think this is part of a larger movement where you and I talked about this a little bit yesterday. The left definitely has been opposed to the freedom of movement that comes with the internal combustion engine. And, America, unlike most other countries, people have cars, they go places, they go far distances. I think that there's, a more sinister motive at hand. And people like Andrew Yang during the presidential primary process, they flat out said that they think that people should only use public transportation, and there should be a fleet of government electric cars that will, taxi people, to, here and there. So, I mean, I come at this from a slightly different perspective. I think this is about control. I think this is about controlling people's movements. And I think that this is the beginning of a much more dire, role.
It's interesting that you say that, Chris, and I'm actually going to come back to that idea towards the end of this podcast, but I definitely want to keep that in mind. So I'm glad that you brought that up. But just to the point of like the resiliency, right? So that's part number 2 that you talk about, like the kind of overarching problems of electric vehicles, Robert. You got the affordability, which we already talked about. The resiliency is number 2. So let's talk about some of these cases when there are blackouts, or when the grid does go down, or when there's just a natural disaster. Like all of these would absolutely cripple the population even more than they already do, because now people can't get around with their, cars that are filled with gas. Like, it seems like we're setting ourselves up for disaster here.
I agree. What are the authorities? What are, federal authorities, state authorities in Louisiana doing? As I recall, they're not shipping in wind turbines and solar panels.
Right.
After the hurricane, what are they shipping in? What do they desperately need? They need liquid petroleum products.
Sure.
They need propane. They need diesel fuel. They need gasoline. Why? Because high energy density, highly flexible, incredibly useful substances that then can be used for transportation, for electricity production, for home heating, for cooking. This is the reality. And yet this, the resilience idea, and this is personal to me. And Isaac and I've talked about this, but I live in Austin, Texas. I was blacked out in February for 45 hours because of Winter Storm Uri. And, I'm fortunate. We had a natural gas connection to our house, so we could cook. We had hot water. We could heat the kitchen, if nothing else, in our home. We had a fireplace. But then I had gasoline in our cars sitting out in the driveway. Would I rather have an electric vehicle when it was free? Now, I know Isaac lives in Minneapolis and I talk about snow. I'm not gonna complain about snow for a guy who lives in Minnesota.
You can complain. It's okay.
Okay. Well,
we know the Southerners are soft.
Absolutely. We're very soft. But a foot of snow. What do I want? If I'm living in Minnesota and it's 20 below zero, do I want to go out there and rely on a battery, or do I want to rely on something at a combustion vehicle that I can be sure will start and run for a while? It's this idea that it goes back to this idea of putting all of our energy eggs in one basket. It's deeply dangerous. And again, I think, I wrote a piece in February about this that showed the blizzard exposes the perils of trying to electrify everything. I'm going to reprise it and write about Hurricane Ida, because it shows again the dangerous nature of this idea that we should electrify everything after a hurricane in which the grid was fundamentally was completely destroyed in Louisiana. And yet you still think it's a good idea to electrify everything? I don't.
Absolutely. And if you need to evacuate, the thing that you want to be able to do is quickly fuel up your car and get out of town.
Right.
And if you have to sit in lines in order to get out of town, and you're watching that battery, just the range slowly tick down as you're waiting for the traffic to move. I mean, this is life and death stuff. And I don't know, like I chalk it up to American energy affluenza.
Right.
Like, we're just so cozy and spoiled. And we don't really understand that these are life and death decisions that we're making, because we have it so good that we think that other priorities have surpassed the need for basic reliability and affordability. And it really takes a circumstance like Winter Storm Uri or a hurricane to shock some people out of that. It's just, how do we convey this message to people without needing that sort of awful stimulus?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that idea of energy affluenza should be like a theme of this episode, because I already touched on it once. You just mentioned it. I plan on touching on it again a couple more times by the end of this episode. But we talked about on this podcast before Joe Biden's plan to transition the entire federal fleet of vehicles over to electric vehicles. And we thought back then, what is this going to look like when FEMA is responding to some type of natural disaster? I bet there are a lot of gas-powered vehicles helping out people in Louisiana right now. How is that going to work with electric vehicles? Are they just going to tow around diesel generators to charge them up whenever they run out of juice? How is that going to work?
And the absurdity of it is, I mean, you've got your finger on it exactly, right, Donald? And just to build on Isaac's point, because I think it's really an excellent one. And about 2 weeks ago, and I've tracked these kinds of incidents over the years, but about 2 weeks ago in Lebanon, and I went to Beirut 4 years ago, and I was glad I went. I wouldn't go back now, of course, but the entire country is in a state of crisis. Why? Because of the collapse of their economy. So what's incredibly short, unavailable in many cases, is gasoline. People are waiting in line for days to get a few gallons of gasoline. It wasn't 2 weeks ago in a town called Acre where 28 people were burned alive while waiting to get gasoline at a government-run distribution point. It's some, it happens. It happened in Mexico a few years ago. It happens in Africa on a fairly regular basis. So this affluenza that Isaac is talking about is exactly right. That, here we have, cities like San Francisco saying, oh, we're going to ban the use of natural gas. Something like 50 communities in California have said they're going to ban natural gas because they think this is going to do something about climate change. Okay, well, isn't that quaint when you have people by the dozens dying, being burned alive, which is horrific, waiting for just a few gallons of gasoline? What does it say about us as a culture? I mean,
Right.
it's depressing.
Yeah. So like that, it's just like that to me is probably the most important point of all of this is just kind of the resiliency of the infrastructure that we have, and just like what if there's a disaster type of a thing, you need gasoline powered cars. To me, I think like that's the most important point. But people that are on the other side of this debate, like people that are more worried about the environment and we'll figure it out, but we have to do this because we have to save ourselves from climate change, theoretical climate change that's happening, whatever generation into the future. I think that your point about the supply chains is probably going to be the most effective for them if the pocketbook one isn't. But the supply chain. So you write in this article, electric vehicles will also make the U.S. more dependent on China. Electrifying just half of our auto fleet will require, in rough terms, about 9 times the current global cobalt production, 3 times global lithium output, and about 2 times current copper production. As the International Energy Agency noted in a May report, China has a majority share in the processing of cobalt, lithium, and the rare earth elements needed to make electric vehicles. And surely this problem would get even worse if China does dip its toes into Afghanistan and starts harvesting out those rare earth elements that we speculated about last episode. So yeah, it's just... I don't think China really cares about how clean the environment is, and if we're putting, if we're going to require more resources that come from China, this problem's only going to get worse.
Well, and you make a great point on the rare earth elements, but also on the cobalt. So if you're driving a Tesla or something, or one of these other electric vehicles, well, how much slave labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo is okay with you? I mean,
child slave labor. That's it. 40,000 kids work in cobalt mines and wash ore in the river. So it's the same people that drink fair trade coffee that refuse to acknowledge the fact that they are not using fair trade cobalt for their automobiles. So I'll let Robert continue his thought. Sorry.
No. And Isaac made that. We shared the stage a few weeks ago in Minneapolis, and he made that point very clearly, and it's exactly on point. There's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to the energy business or anything else. And this idea that we'll just switch to something else. Well, that comes with a cost. Okay, well, so where's the lithium going to come from? What about the copper, the manganese, the zinc? China, if you look at the IEA's May report on these issues, China has, in some cases, and not just a majority of the processing, but a super majority of the processing. So this idea that we're going to, we're not going to use oil, we're not going to depend on OPEC, and now instead we're going to pivot and depend on China. China's not our friend. I'm not a China basher, but it is clear they're not our friend. And the idea that we should make our entire transportation sector dependent on supply chains that that China dominates, and just, again, it makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, no, I always comment on this idea that we, during the Trump administration, we celebrated this idea that we got energy independent. And now with all of these plans, whether it's to, require all of this wind and solar for our energy production, or, electrifying our entire fleet of vehicles, like all we're doing is becoming dependent on China because they've got all these rare earth materials. Sorry, Chris, I cut you off.
Oh, no, I was actually just going to piggyback off of what Robert was saying. And I am more of a opponent of China. And
yeah, I was going to say that. I'm a China basher.
Yeah,
so
I am an unavowed China basher. And when I look at what they did to the PPE market in the wake of the the COVID-19 outbreak, how they hoarded and then price gouged the entire world on PPE. It just makes me wonder what they would do, in terms of jacking up the prices of these rare earth elements. And I do not want to be dependent upon China. I think we already are too dependent on China. And I just think that this is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, Isaac, and you could probably jump on, the idea of the environmentalists not wanting to mine. You've talked about that, right? Mining in
absolutely.
Minnesota, but it's okay if China does it. Like, that's fine.
Well, and it's interesting because China uses slave labor in their factories to build solar panels in Western China. They're built in factories powered by coal. That's New York Times said that. So I think that we can, even though maybe we're a little skeptical of their reporting frequently, if they're going to say it, then we need to take it seriously. So the Biden administration, before the election, they indicated that they'd be open to mining the materials that we need for electric vehicles in Minnesota. I know that the listeners have heard me talk about this enough, but Minnesota has the largest undeveloped deposits of copper and nickel in the world, and we have the largest cobalt deposits in the United States. So when it comes time to actually move some dirt and mine some of these materials in the United States, you have Congressman Betty McCollum come out and say, no, we don't want to do that, even though she does not represent that district. So it's this, Robert talks about the urban-rural divide a lot when it comes to, installing wind turbines and solar panels. But there's also this kind of, urban arrogance and not allowing mining to happen as well. So they want to not have any of the wind turbines and solar panels in their backyard. But when it comes time to actually producing the minerals needed to build those wind turbines and solar panels and the economic activity that would come along with that, they're not in favor of it. So but after the election, Biden said he was probably going to try and get those metals from allies instead of producing them domestically, which I thought was just criminal abdication of his responsibility. Like, I think, well, not really criminal, right? That's hyperbole, but dereliction of duty for sure. I think that the job of the president should be to get all the jobs, not some of the jobs. And that means mining and refining those materials and reducing our dependence on China for that.
Can I jump in, Isaac? I just was so if the U.S. decided, and let's just assume that tomorrow, the administration and Congress say, okay, well, we don't want to depend on them.
Yep.
How long would it take to ramp up a decent size copper and rare earth element mining operation in the United States? How many years in terms of getting it permitted and getting it launched? With 10 years, is that fair enough? Or
that would be charitable, honestly. From an environmental review process, the Polymet mine in Minnesota is going on something like 16 years, and we're still not moving dirt. So we'd likely have similar timelines for other projects. And, go ahead, Donnie.
Well, does that incorporate the time delays when environmentalists chain themselves to bulldozers and stuff? Because I don't know if you're taking that into account.
This is all the prep work to that, honestly. They have not gotten to that point yet here in Minnesota because of they haven't needed to. Basically, there's been enough lawsuits that they've done to gum up the works. But, once a mining company clears all of those legal hurdles, that's when that'll start to happen. So,
no kidding.
Yeah. So even blue skying it, then, Isaac, in your view, it's at least a decade. So that doesn't fit on any of the time frames that are being discussed now in terms of like GM saying they're going to turn their whole fleet over to or electrify all of their vehicles and only sell and quit selling internal combustion engine vehicles. So even if we blue sky it in the most lenient kind of scenario, you're saying it's at least a decade before we'd get significant amounts of new copper or new rare earths being produced here in the U.S.
Yep. Australia and Canada have a more streamlined process for building mines and evaluating their environmental impact. So, I mean, if you did that, maybe it could be 5 to 10 years instead of 10 to 15, but you still need to get all the processing plants permitted too. And we haven't built new smelters in the United States in a long time.
Yeah, well, we'll see if, Australian citizens are even allowed out of their house by then, but that still remains to be seen. I've got an article here, and everything that we talk about, all the articles that I reference during this episode, you can find in the show notes underneath the video here. I've got a piece from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Would more electric vehicles be good for the environment? The short answer is no. And there's just a couple of bullet points. Some of it we already covered, just the amount of rare earth materials that we would need, lithium, cobalt, all of that stuff that we would need to dig out of the ground somewhere. We already covered that. But it also says an electric vehicle battery requires more energy to manufacture than a battery for a conventional vehicle and results in more carbon emissions during the manufacturing stage. This so-called carbon debt is incurred by each electric vehicle before it even driven its first mile and may take years to repay. And that is an estimate I've actually heard from a bunch of different places. Some of them suggest that it takes several years before it ever starts becoming more green than its counterpart. I've seen other estimates that suggest that like it will never be more green than its counterpart. Robert, have you heard any figures on that idea?
I don't have any data on that, so I hesitate to weigh in. But I mean, the old saw I think is still true. What's the greenest car that you can buy, though? It's the one that you already own. Right.
Sure.
So, and I think that that's one of the things, if I can just revert though to this Chris brought it up earlier about the idea of mobility. And I know I'm maybe jumping ahead here, Donald, but it's just the idea of mobility is about economic mobility. Well, economic mobility for a lot of people in this country depend on their physical mobility. And one of the big fights underway in California now is over this tax on vehicle miles traveled, which even though California is millions of units of housing short, they're imposing new rules that would increase the cost of housing by putting a VMT tax on every new unit of housing being built. So this issue about vehicles and mobility and supply chains and all the rest of it, I think there's something to what Chris is saying here about this, the limitation of people's ability to actually be mobile in society, because their physical mobility determines their economic mobility.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just real quick, Donnie, I also equate that to the pandemic and how they wanted us to remain sheltered in place. I think it's about control. I think it's about lack of freedom, and I think that the automobile is the ultimate form of American freedom, and it's been that way since the 1950s, since we built the federal highway system, and they're trying to undo that in one fell swoop.
Yeah, just a couple of more points, and then I will move on. A couple more points about just the environmental impact of all of this. I already saw a commenter kind of bring this up, which is, how green your car is. The electricity kind of really depends on where you're plugging it in, right? So if you're in a state that still gets the majority of its power from coal or fossil fuels, well, guess what? Your electric car is actually a coal-powered car, right? So like that's definitely a point to bring up. And then just as these batteries and these electric vehicles start to expire, you have to do something with them, right? I'm sure a lot of them will end up in landfills, which probably doesn't sound too green. But like I said, this if you want to look at this study that I'm talking about, the competitive enterprise thing, the link is in the show notes. You can get in a little bit more in depth on that. But you touch on this at the end of the one article that I keep referencing of yours, Robert, the idea that electric cars are inevitable and they're the future of personal transportation. It's just a matter of time. Maybe we overestimated the tech. Maybe we overestimated the timeline, but give it a few more years. Certainly these are going to take over and they'll be commonplace. Now, granted, we hear this all the time, whether it's, we're always 10 years away from a climate doom or the big efficiency gains in wind and solar that are just right around the corner. But do you think that any tech will supplant gas-powered personal transportation in the future? Like, because I've heard some stories about hydrogen power. Glenn Beck talked about how he got to test drive a hydrogen-powered car back for like a couple of weeks. And he said that like GM before 2008 was like super behind this idea of hydrogen power before the collapse happened and then the bailouts. And one of the stipulations of the bailouts was like, okay, you have to actually focus on electric vehicles, get rid of this hydrogen stuff. So in your opinion, like what's your predictions, I guess, for the personal transportation in the near to long-term future?
Well, so near term, what's near term, what's long term? I think our energy and power systems of the future, and by that I mean the next 20 to 30 years, are going to look a lot like what they do today. I've made this line before, used it a million times. The electric vehicle is the next big thing, and it always will be.
Right.
But why do people prefer? And just a quick vignette. I live here in Austin. I was in North Austin just a couple of days ago. I went through Town North Nissan, which is the biggest dealership in this region, and I just drove through. I didn't get out of my vehicle. I did once, but I looked through. I drove through the lot. There were no Nissan Leafs on the lot. There were no electric vehicles to be had. What were they selling? They were selling Rogues. They were selling sedans. If there was demand, where were the vehicles? So just a final point on internal combustion. If oil didn't exist, we would have to invent it. For
Right.
all of the demonization of the oil and gas companies that's been going on for decades. And I understand that why they, the easy target. But oil is a miracle substance. If we didn't have it, we'd have to invent it when it comes to cost, ease of handling, flexibility, energy density, storing it at standard temperature and pressure. It's unbelievably flexible. And so I think we're going to be using internal combustion engines for decades to come because of they have the attributes that ordinary consumers need. They need that flexibility, they need quick refueling, all of those things that they want, and relatively low cost of ownership.
Yeah, there was one article I came across, and this is actually thanks to a video that our producer Andy published somewhat recently that was called Turns Out Californians Hate Electric Vehicles. If you want to see Andy's beautiful face, you can go to our Heartland Institute YouTube channel and find this video. But there was actually a lot of information in there that shocked me. We already talked about a couple of things, California requiring or telling people not to charge their cars at night during like a heat wave and all of this. But there was one study that he referenced, and it was a study published in Nature Journal that surveyed Californians who purchased an electric vehicle between the years 2012 and 2018. The research found that 20% pretty quickly switched back to gas-powered cars. And the most common cause for that switchback, and you just referenced this, Robert, was that charging the cars was a hassle. So then in this Yahoo Money article that, again, I have everything linked in the show notes, it talks about the levels of charging stations. So most people have a level 1 charger for cars. It's like standard home outlet at home, which delivers 120 volts. Then there's the level 2 chargers that are higher powered specialty connections that deliver twice that.
Yep,
and then there's
like your washer dryer.
Right. And then there's the Tesla superchargers that run on 480 volts. And I'm sure you need some specialists to come in and rig that up for you. But in roughly 3 minutes, this is according to this article, this Yahoo Money article, in roughly 3 minutes, you can fill the gas tank of a Ford Mustang and have enough range to go about 300 miles with its V8 engine. For Bloomberg automotive analyst Kevin Teenan, an hour plugged into his household outlet gave the Mach-E just 3 miles of range. So overnight, this is quoting him, overnight, we're looking at 36 miles of range. That is like mind-blowing to me. You could have your car plugged in all night, and then your like Mustang Mach-E only can go like 36 miles down the street.
And if I can jump in here. So when we talk about travel, when, you say, oh, well, where's that place? And they say, oh, well, it's 20 minutes away. They don't tell you it's 5 miles. They say it will take you about 20 minutes to get there. Well, what are people saying? How do they talk about their transportation needs and what their desires are? They talk in time elements.
Right.
They don't talk in distance. So our time budgets for travel are what we care about. We don't the distance is immaterial to us if we're thinking about how long does it take to get there. Well, those time budgets are critical when it comes to refueling as well. In July, my wife Lauren and I drove to Colorado. We were refueling, as you pointed out, in our Toyota 4Runner, 3 or 4 minutes, and we're back on the road. And instead of an hour or 2 hours, 3 hours to recharge, are you out of your mind?
Right.
People won't allow, they don't have the time for that. And that's one of the key issues here, along with all of these other issues. And I thought that California study you referenced was really telling. Why are people turning them back in? Because they don't want to hassle with they're wasting time refueling their vehicle. They have other things to do.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with a brother-in-law where he was talking about, how long it would charge, how long it would take, even if you had like a supercharger station or whatever. And it was like some number that he pulled up was saying like, maybe it wouldn't fully charge the car, but if you had it plugged in for 15 minutes, and he's like, that's no different than going to the gas station. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, filling up your gas is like 3 minutes. Like you're going to be sitting there for 15 minutes. You might as well like pop open Netflix and start watching a TV show. You're going to be there a while, man. I think
that's why Teslas have that big screen.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So Teslas have like the entertainment system there. And part of the reason is because you have to sit there and wait for your car to charge.
That's pretty insane. So there's a bunch of information. We're not going to get to everything, but you just check out the show notes. I got a whole bunch of links to a whole bunch of other stuff. Some more that elaborates on California, asking people to not charge during these like nighttime hours that you would tend to charge because of a heat wave and all of that. But I want to get to another couple of points. So in our conversation that I referenced earlier, Isaac, you had brought up the angle about Gavin Newsom, California Governor Gavin Newsom, And he signed an executive order last September to have all new passenger car and truck sales in the state be all electric by 2035. So, we talked about this when it happened on the show. And, it's funny to laugh at California sometimes. When something happens in California, inevitably it's going to be proposed in New York and then Illinois, and then it's going to be a national conversation at some point. But you brought up the angle that this might actually be hurting him. This might actually be hurting Gavin Newsom with his upcoming recall election. Is that really the case?
I think it might. I think that the fact that they're asking people not to do their laundry when they come home from work is a lot bigger problem for Gavin Newsom.
Right.
And also because only 6% of the cars in California are electric at this point. But yeah, I think that it is not helping him. I think that when, his opponents are out there campaigning, they get to say, look, this is an executive order that's going to hurt everyday Californians, and I'm going to repeal it. So, and that would actually be pretty great. Frankly, the California Air Resources Board is a very powerful entity of unelected bureaucrats that basically dictate policy for much of the country. So when the Congress developed the Clean Air Act, they gave California a special waiver that allowed them to set their own criteria or their pollution standards for things like ozone, PM 2.5, so small particulate matter, nitrous oxides, or I think I said ozone already. But basically, you can either choose to follow the federal standard or the California standard. And states are given the option to either go with the federal standard or do the California thing. So right now, we have California taking it a step further. They're saying, well, we have these mandates for electric vehicles that say X number of the cars sold in the state need to be electric. And if you don't meet this quota, you need to buy credits from somebody like Tesla in order to do business in our state. And other states like Minnesota are adopting these mandates, and it's all being promulgated by the California Air Resources Board. So if you had a conservative governor of California who decided that they were going to roll back some of these executive orders, it would have a huge impact on the entire country. So we're not electioneering because this is a 501c3 podcast, but to deny the fact that having a different governor with different energy policies would not be a profound benefit for the whole country would be wrong, because it would be pretty good.
And one other thing I want to touch on public transportation based on a couple of articles that you sent me, Isaac. But before we move on to that, I do want to just mention something that I kind of touched on at the beginning of this, which is like, if you bought an electric vehicle and you're happy with it and it works with your lifestyle and all that, fantastic.
Cool.
That's great. Like I'm not advocating against that at all. I don't want there to be some ban on electric vehicles. It's, to me, like if it's just a matter of personal preference, then great. If people are just like rationally making their own decisions, again, based on their own situation, fantastic. It's when these things start being mandated and we start saying that, 10% of sales have to be, electric vehicle by this date, or by this date, everything's got to be electric, or anything like that. That's when I start getting mad. And that's when we start doing these podcast episodes explaining why all of these things are terrible. So stop mandating stuff and we'll stop complaining. Okay. How about that? But Isaac, you sent me an article talking about how in, I think just Minneapolis, maybe they're trying to electrify all of their public transportations, their buses and all of that. And how like some studies are showing that like that's just a disaster waiting to happen, especially when it gets cold.
Well, they did the pilot program. So Duluth,
happened.
Minnesota, which is north of Minneapolis, it's much colder there and it's much hillier. They tried to have some electric buses. That did not go well for them. They lost up to 60% of their range before they installed diesel heaters on the buses to keep them from draining the battery when it's cold out. So there's like a 7-county metropolitan area. So we'll just call it like Minneapolis, St. Paul area transit system tried to do electric buses. And they realized that they just didn't work very well. They couldn't get them to charge correctly. And they actually needed to bring in 5 diesel buses to do the job of I think it's like 15. They said in the article, replacing a diesel bus with an electric bus is not a 1-for-1 replacement.
Oh my God.
You would need 3 electric buses to do the same job as a single diesel.
That thing's so green. That's like the greenest thing I've ever heard of.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
as Isaac says that in my head, you know, he's talking about transportation, but I'm thinking about wind turbines and solar panels
Exactly.
because
It's
it's
the
the
same thing.
same
Yeah.
exact issue on the electric grid. Okay, so I have solar panels on the roof of my house. I live in Texas. There's $66 billion spent on wind and solar in Texas before the blackouts in February. Well, okay, you built all this stuff, but when the chips were down in February and we were on the precipice of a grid collapse, all of that investment was effectively worth nothing. So not only do we have to keep the existing infrastructure, the existing thermal power plants, we want to add the rest of this. Well, it's a misallocation of capital. You're spending a whole lot more money to go back to Isaac's point. Well, now you have where you used to have 5 buses, now you got 20. Well, you have to put tires on all of them. You have to insure all of them. You have to maintain all of them. You know, I don't know if those are the exact right numbers, but it's the same paradigm about having more than you need. Well, that's not the best way to run a business.
Yeah. So just kind of like we've only got a few minutes left here, but I want to do a little this glimmer of hope, which actually ties into that point that Chris made earlier in the show. That I think that it is actually very possible that we will see a mass adoption of electric cars in our lifetime. But it's not going to be the way you think it's going to be. I think that it's very possible that we're going to see Google or Amazon or Tesla develop a fleet of self-driving electric Uber type cars that instead of owning a car, you just order one of these up on your phone. They pull up, you get in, you say where you want to go, drops you off, and then you walk away. Right?
Donnie, that take is like 5 years ago. Get out of here with your ancient takes.
And then when the car runs out of battery, it just automatically goes to its warehouse and starts filling up. And I think that this idea, I'm not even really advocating for this, but this idea kind of goes along with what Chris is saying here. And it goes along with an op-ed that used to be hosted on the World Economic Forum website until they took it down after we talked about it too much, that in the future, you won't own anything and you'll be happy about it. So I could see like these mega corporations owning these fleets of cars. And it's just basically a way to make sure that you don't own your own car out of convenience and not out of some type of mandate. That's my prediction for the future. Isaac, you think that's an outdated one? Robert, you're kind of squinting your eyes. I don't know if you're buying it.
They'll get my car keys, and when they pry them out of my cold dead hands, I think is the to bastardize a long used phrase. But there's something about owning your own vehicle and being able to go where you want, when you want, at the speed that you want. Oh, and I want to stop at the store. Oh, I need some, whatever. I need another bale of toilet paper from Costco, whatever it is. That back to Chris's point about this idea. I mean, Chevy used to have an ad. It's not just your car, it's your freedom, right? I mean, and Chris has made that point already. So, and Isaac, yeah, I mean, these self-driving cars, where are they? We've heard about this, the hype about this forever. Well, where the hell are they?
Oh, I get that. I think that a lot of that's probably explained by government red tape. There's one accident and that prolongs the process by like 5 years or something like that. Not to, poo-poo an accident or anything like that.
Well, when your robot runs into my robot, who pays? I mean, what's the deal?
Yeah, the algorithm pays. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say, I think that, your idea or your, vision of the future, that might work in a densely populated urban area. But what about all the Americans that live in, rural areas where they need a car to drive long distances at the drop of a hat? So,
I agree with that. And just like Uber, just like Uber started in densely populated cities and then it eventually expanded out into the suburbs and all of that. And I bet you could be downstate Illinois and still find an Uber to take you somewhere. So yeah, certainly it would start in these high dense population areas and then expand out.
Right. And I vividly remember during the presidential debates that Andrew Yang was basically making the exact same point you did. And in his utopia, we don't own cars. We just use a car to get from point A to point B. But I just think that is so like farcical. And I mean, I as an American, I just enjoy going for a drive every once in a while. It's just good to get out and just, drive. So this idea that cars would be strictly to get us from point A to point B, and they would be government controlled or for some giant corporation, that just goes against everything that the automobile has changed and transformed America over the past 70, 80 years.
Yeah, again, I'm not advocating for this, by the way.
Why would they use an electric vehicle instead of a gas or diesel powered vehicle? I mean, that's the question. It doesn't
Because they
have
have
to
to
be
virtue
electric.
signal. Because they have to virtue signal. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, sure, but like they'll say it's going to
Less
be electric in
maintenance.
order to get subsidies for developing the AI technology, maybe. But
Right.
like, why would it need to be electric? You wouldn't want it to be electric for the exact same reasons we just talked about. Do you
Right.
have 8 hours to charge this vehicle halfway when you could use, like, the utility of the vehicle is so much less than a gasoline powered vehicle, and it would actually be worse if you had a giant fleet of them because you would want to refuel them faster.
Right. No, I get that. And
Hang
I
your
see
head in
somebody's-
shame, Donald.
I'm not advocating for this. I see a bunch of comments in here. No private property. This is about freedom. That's not
Socialist
freedom.
Donnie strikes again.
But I think that this ties into a point that we talked about before, the whole nation of renters and BlackRock buying up all these houses and the idea of, like, again, in the future, you're not going to own anything. You're not going to own any land. You're just going to rent. You're not going to own a car. You're just going to Uber one. You know, I think that is...
John Lennon sang that song like 50 or 60 years ago.
I don't
and it hasn't
want
happened.
this to happen. I don't want it to happen.
It's
but
a
that seems to be
stupid
the trend
idea.
that they're pushing
It's
for.
a stupid
that's all I'm
idea,
saying.
Donnie.
I agree. I agree. All right. We're already past time here. I want to thank everyone for tuning into this episode of the In the Tank podcast. If you are listening to this only, you're probably listening on a Friday. Join us on Thursday when we record the show live on Thursdays at noon. You could tune into YouTube or Facebook. You can send us your comments and all of that live, and we might put it on the screen. We might respond to it, all of that good stuff. If you like our show, please subscribe, write a review for us on iTunes. It'd be greatly appreciated. You could subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to watch it that way. If you want to send us your comments or suggestions to the show, feel free to email us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Robert, Bryce, thank you for being on with us. For people that want to stay up to date with all the work that you're doing, where can they go to see your work?
Oh, you can't miss me. I'm on the interweb, on the Google. RobertBryce.com is my website. I'm also a research fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity here in Austin. And a shout out to Isaac. He and I were able to do some work together on a report that we did for the Center of the American Experiment on wind turbines and land use that came out called Not in Our Backyard. That's on their website. And I'm on Twitter, Power Hungry, at PWR Hungry. So I'm easy to find.
Well, and don't be modest. I see that you've got Power Hungry podcast back there. So if
no one's ever accused me of being humble, Donnie. That's not happened yet. I don't expect it to.
And you also got a new book out, don't you?
You're so good to mention that as well. There it is. The Question of Power, Electricity, and the Wealth of Nations, available at all fine booksellers. JuiceTheMovie.com is the website for the film. So yes, you can't miss me.
All right, fantastic. Isaac Orr, where can the fine people find you?
All right. So for all of my substantive work, please check out AmericanExperiment.org. And for all of my snarky tweets, I am at The Fracking Guy.
All right. Fantastic. And Chris Talgo, you are a ghost on social media. So just join me in saying goodbye to the fine people.
Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next week.
All right. Goodbye. Talk to you next week.